To the Groucho Book Club. I'm Madeline Davis. By day, I'm a health correspondent at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, but by night, I read a lot of fiction. And at weekends, I particularly like reading fiction with a large glass of wine on the table next to me. And that brings me on to a nice little offer I'm very pleased to tell you about tonight. So our partners and fellow Groucho members, Marlowe, who are online wine retailers, have given all Groucho members a 15% discount. So if you head to marlowe.wines, you'll be able to see all their selection. The discount code is Groucho15, that's all in caps. So yes, many thanks to Marlowe for keeping us all lubricated and convivial, especially during these difficult times. Oh, I hear a few more people joining. Welcome everyone. So just one more housekeeping point before we begin. We just ask that you all mute yourselves while the discussion's going on, just so there aren't any interruptions. But we do want it to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions or comments or thoughts, just ping them through in the chat. I'll be reading that as the discussion goes on, and I'll try and ask as many of your questions as possible. And we also might have some time at the end. So if you want to pose a question directly to Ashton, you'll be able to. So if everybody has themselves muted, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Ashton Applewhite, author of This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. She also runs the Yo, Is This Ageist blog, and her 2017 TED Talk, Let's End Ageism, has been viewed by more than 1.5 million people. So welcome, Ashton. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
And I just wanted to start by saying how inspiring I found your book. It really kind of opened my eyes to the ageist narratives that I'd internalized. And I found it very comforting. You kind of showed me that all the things that I was worried about growing old, about losing my memory, about becoming infirm, about being quite lonely and quite depressed, were actually ageist stereotypes and narratives that are not necessarily borne out by the data. So to start, could you just tell us why you started researching ageism and where the book began?
I started looking into aging about 15 years ago, and I have to say, if you had told me that I would become obsessed by aging, I would have thought, why do I want to spend my time thinking about something depressing and yucky? Mm-hmm. And you know, aging is living. It's how we move through life. As you're a journalist, I'm sort of a journalist myself. You can't do what we do if you're not a generalist. And it is the biggest topic there is. It's fascinating. But I had no idea. I was afraid of getting old. I was in my mid-50s, and I started researching longevity because that's sort of what I do. I'm thinky, and that's how I burrow into things, and learned in a matter of, it's probably months, but it feels like weeks, the facts with which I started my TED Talk out, 10 years later, I thought the odds of ending up in a nursing home were pretty good. I probably would have put them at 25 or 30%. And at that time, it's 4% of Americans over 65 that end up in institutional care. Now it's down to 2.5%. It's not that the scary shit isn't real. Some part of your body is going to fall apart. People you've known all your lives are going to die. You might run out of money, etc. But that our fears are so out of proportion to the reality. So what I want people to do is think about where those fears come from and who benefits from them.
Yeah, and one of the other key facts I found in your book that I found fascinating was that people in their 80s are actually happier than people in their 30s. Could you just tell us a bit about that? Well,
older people enjoy actually better mental health than the young or middle-aged. It's a function of the way aging itself affects the healthy brain. Part of it is called the positivity effect, where we tend to fixate on the more positive things, but part of it is just living longer. When something ghastly happens, you've been through this before. You have more experience to draw on. When I first it's called the U-bend in Brit speak. That's how The Economist refers to it. The U-bend of happiness. And I thought they must have cornered two 80-year-olds and given them a cookie. I mean, I found it, I mean, I was incredulous. And then I thought, well, it must be true if you're wealthy or if you're healthy or if you're married, you know, happily or whatever. And it obtains across class, across geography. You know, it is a function of greater equanimity and perspective and an ability to live more in the moment. Kids do that because they're not capable of living anywhere but the moment. And older people simply get better in later life, really 80s, you know, and 90s, at appreciating the here and now and not sweating the small stuff. And that is what confers happiness.
Mm. Yeah, and you mentioned in your book that there were some studies, researchers kind of asked older people about their quality of life. And I found the results really surprising, in that people who had amazing health, you know, some of them said, I've got an awful life. And people who, you know, had quite serious health conditions sometimes said, you know, my life's amazing. And so it really is about perspective. So how do you think, you know, what's coloring our perspective on aging?
Well, I mean, back to that, you know, my guess is the people who were optimistic and rolled with the punches did so when they were 18 and are better. You know, we think we're going to wake up old. You know, when does old begin? Well, you don't wake up different, and you don't wake up some morning and everything's gone to hell. You're just yourself, only a little bit older all the way through. The short answer to, I mean, the narrative, again, it's not that the scary things aren't real, it's that we live in Western culture that drowns out all but the negative. And I think the short answer is that if aging is framed as a problem, we can be persuaded to buy stuff to fix it, just like, you know, body fat, or, you know, all these socially constructed, you know, if you differ from the social, this imagined ideal, which is typically young, thin, white, male, you know, Christian, well off, and so on, then you can be persuaded to buy things to bring you back closer to that norm. And in the case of aging, we live in a culture that says younger is better and older is not so good. You know, people are satisfied. People can't profit. Companies and businesses can't profit off satisfaction. And if natural transitions of aging are pathologized, like, you know, hormone shifts, and which is not to say there are medical conditions that of course people should treat, but if natural transitions are seen as shameful or disease rather than just something that happens, then of course we can be persuaded to buy things to treat them or cure them. And so, whereas, you know, aging is not a problem or a disease. Aging is moving through life. It starts happening when we're born. It's not just something annoying that old people do. And it is this powerful process that unites us all. In other words, because of capitalism, sexism, patriarchy, you know, all those things.
All the isms. Yeah, I thought you put it so well in your book when you said it's not ageism that's difficult. It's not aging that's difficult. It's ageism.
Right. The problem isn't getting older. The problem is being discriminated against on the basis of it and being denied opportunity and voice and access.
Mm-hmm. And you wrote in your book, I think it was in your TED Talk speak actually, that aging actually affects us on a cellular level. Could you just describe some of those effects of ageism?
Yeah. I love this there's more research out all the time. And I just have to say, since you write about science, that this is blue chip science. I did not go digging, you know, for some obscure journal that, you know, would substantiate some crazy theory I had. That attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. I mean, it's the mind-body connection, but in this arena. And the way the media usually frames it is that people with positive attitudes towards aging do better. I say people with fact rather than fear-based attitudes towards aging, because it's, you know, I don't want it to seem like some sort of gray washing or happy talk. So people with fact rather than fear-based attitudes live longer, an average of 7.5 years longer. We walk faster. We are more likely to heal completely from severe disability. And my favorite finding is that we are less likely to develop Alzheimer's, even if you have the gene that predisposes you to the disease. I mean, if we could get these things out in the world, you know, I would never say in writing that ageism makes you sick, but ageism, having these not challenging these stereotypes, just accepting this narrative of gloom and decline makes you way more vulnerable to exactly the things you fear. There's certainly, I mean, Alzheimer's is my biggest fear, and you know, there's no guarantee, but educating ourselves about aging, like I think like anything scary, you know, the monster under the bed, you know, there is a monster under the bed. There, you know, we're going to get older, we're going to die, but just looking at it reduces it from, you know, a phantasm that incorporates all your fears to something manageable. I mean, talking about aging paves the way to talking about dying. No one wants to talk about dying, but the minute you initiate that conversation, it feels good. It's a relief to people. It's better than the terrifying unknown by far.
Definitely. And we've talked about kind of who's profiting from ageism. Who are the actors that are kind of perpetuating this misinformation, do you think?
Well, the anti-aging piece of the skincare market is a multi-billion-dollar proposition. The you know, life extension, the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, and some, and there's also there's all sorts of, you know, Silicon Valley startups. It's a huge sort of Wild West out there. But you know, when aging is framed as the enemy, then anyone who can claim to stop it or cure it can get a hold, you know, on people's imaginations and make and profit from that, you know, profit from our insecurities, profit from our fears. If you can put those fears in perspective, there are things each of us can do in our own lives to see more clearly, to, I mean, the most important component of a good old age, I assumed it was health heading into this. Then I thought it was wealth. It is having a solid social network. You know, you can't buy that. But you can work from an early age to have friends of all ages, you know. And if we have older friends, then I mean, one of the problems is we live in such an age segregated society. I imagine it's worse in the US than anywhere else. But I always think that, and there's data for that. But you know, there are tons of ways we can mediate our circumstances just by learning more and coming out of our foxholes, if you will, to look around. I mean, there's older people in the world in all kinds of interesting ways around us, even if they are physically challenged, even if they do have cognitive challenges. It doesn't mean their lives aren't worth living and they're not enjoying them.
Mm-hmm. And this is a question from the audience. Do you think different cultures or countries do aging and death better? You know, is it Western society that's particularly ageist?
You know, it's complicated, of course. People often ask plaintively, like, isn't it better somewhere else, with some idea that in the East in particular, older people are revered. There are cultures with a tradition of Confucianism, of ancestor worship, where older people have a ritualized position and a place in society that certainly in the US they don't. Anywhere urbanization and industrialization have made inroads, it fosters age separation. You know, you have people left behind in the country or left behind in the apartment, and working age, so-called working age people go off to work, and that's not so great. And there is a connecting of the value of a person to their conventional economic productivity, a very loaded word, and neither of those are friends of older people, but neither was the invention of the printing press. I mean, for a long time there, older people were repositories of knowledge in a way in which we simply no longer are, and I'm not sorry the printing press got invented. In African American culture here, indigenous cultures, elders do have positions of authority. But I always like to point out that in cultures where older people, where you had primogeniture and you have the ancestor worship and you couldn't inherit unless you were the oldest, and gerontocracies, which the early United States was a gerontocracy. Older people had all the power. A factoid that I love, which when I encountered that, I had a hard time getting my head around it. I mean, this was years ago. It was like, wait, it rocked to be old here. And think about what people wore. White wigs and stiff frock coats and stockings that expose the lower leg, fashions that flatter the older body, right? Which is just an example of how we make this stuff up. But societies like that are terrible societies in which to be young. Right. And I think, so it's really important not to say, oh, I want to be worshipped because I'm old, or, I don't think older people have more value than, I don't think you get anything special because you're older unless you need, a place to sit or a place by a fire. And then that's because of your physical condition, not because of your age, right? And what we really want, now that the whole world is living longer, I mean, population aging is a massive, permanent demographic trend. I have a friend, a journalist friend, who calls it global wrinkling. Longer lives are here to stay. How do we distribute? How do we develop a society that supports people all the way across the lifespan in the different ways we need, and avoid positioning it as, selfish old people or greedy young people, and because we all need help all lifelong. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that was a really long answer. You want me to talk shorter?
No, that was fascinating. And do you think there's a difference between how men and women approach aging? This is another question from the audience.
For sure. I mean, newsflash, we live in a patriarchy. Women are judged far more harshly for our appearance. And there's a really horrendous phrase. Economists call it the attractiveness penalty. I mean, if you look at women in the workforce, first you're, too young to be taken seriously, or, you're sexualized or whatever, then you might be thinking about having children, so you're distractible. Then you have children and become incompetent, or you don't have children, thereby proving you're, doubly useless to a patriarchy. And then you cease being able to have children, and then you fall off a cliff entirely. Women are never the right age. Our age is used against us from the get-go. And unless we can look differently, starting by looking at ourselves differently, starting by throwing off, and it is an ongoing task. It's the work of a lifetime. We need to engage in it with other women, but to look more generously at ourselves first of all, and each other, and refuse, to say that the most important thing about us is our appearance, and the most important way in which we can contribute to society is by being fertile. Sorry, that made me think of Amy Coney Barrett. That was a bad moment.
I thought
and I mean, if the goal, and I don't mean to say that it should be, but is to remain sexually active. And there are lots of older women who by the time they reach menopause or beyond, they're so over it. They're over being objectified. They're over wearing uncomfortable shoes, and they find that liberating. That's fantastic. We each have to do this in our own way. But for the purpose of argument, if the goal is to be sexually active, or to be seen as a sexual, sexual person, think of your friends who are. They're not the youngest. They're not the thinnest. They're not the prettiest. They are, and I'm speaking in a gendered context because you asked about women. They are the women who know their lovers are lucky, and that means working together to cast off the ugly misogynist message that says to age is to fail, wrinkles are ugly, you should go, you should lie about your age, you should distance yourself from older women because they will, leech your power. Older women should distance themselves from younger women because they make us look old. I mean, those are poisonous, horrible, noxious ideas. I wish everyone would start I think consciousness raising is a really powerful tool. And mixed age consciousness raising groups around age bias, I think, are really powerful ways. And I will say there is a free downloadable guide to starting a consciousness raising group on age bias on my website, thischairrocks.com.
Yeah, excellent. I found all the tips in your book very helpful as well. And you also described how not only how, women become old hags and men become sort of distinguished silver foxes, but also how women bear the brunt of caregiving. So they, bear the brunt of ageism in that way as well. Could you just kind of describe that?
Well, we all know that women's work is undervalued and often underpaid. I mean, we've seen it in the wake of COVID with women in general, and in particular, I think it's been measured in terms of contributions to scientific papers. Massive amounts of research happening with COVID. Number of proportion written by women vastly plummeted because women remain responsible still for the bulk of work in the domestic sphere, as which and caregiving is part of that. Most of it's done by free, much of it by ill-paid women of color. And caregiving is a beautiful, tender, incredibly important part of life. So we don't, whether it's for our children, our parents, our friends, what's problematic is going it alone without supports. If we had subsidies of all forms, barter, social security, whatever, and equal leave for women, and it was decently paid, then it wouldn't be a gendered handicap. And this needs to change.
Yeah, for sure. I can't imagine a worse society that doesn't value the people that look after other people.
Yeah, there's that old, you can judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable members.
Mm-hmm. And another key takeaway from your book was how ageism keeps us from doing things that potentially we love. So you described going to an electronic dance concert, even though some people might have been surprised to see you there. What do you think we can do to encourage people not to hold themselves back just because of their age?
That's a great question. I think the best thing to do is when you find yourself using age as a rationalization for not doing something, or as a justification, to hold back, stop and think about whether age is really the reason. I mean, with the exception of extreme sports and extreme physical activities, because your body does, we lose strength. I mean, I can't even run anymore, which in theory depresses me, but in point of fact, I don't really have to run that much anymore. Or I don't run for fun. Are you doing it? Are you doing it for a real legitimate reason, or is it because you think you'll stand out? Because if we don't go there and integrate the space with our presence, then nothing changes, right? We stay home, we become more self-conscious. I think especially for older people, there's this sort of pernicious notion of not only will people look at me, when they might look at you twice, but they won't want me there. That is really not the case. I mean, there's always a few idiots who don't want, people of color, or don't want men or women, or, don't want people who are different from them. But that's most people aren't going to pay any attention at all. And some people will be delighted. I mean, one easy way, none of this is easy. Breaking habits is never easy. But one thing to think about is when you get to a social gathering, do you just make a beeline for people your own age? And if everyone in the room is the same age, just as if everyone were the same color or the same background, might you diversify it? Talk to your neighbor. I mean, I had my dentist receptionist. She knows I write about this, and she said, "Oh, I was invited to a birthday party of someone in my apartment building who's much younger," and she chickened out. She just felt that she would stand out. And if you don't want to do the thing, I mean, you shouldn't go, to an event that you don't want to go to, or do something because it will make you look young. There's no such thing as looking young or looking old. You can only look the age you are. But if it is something you want to do, I urge you to do it, and don't let your age stand in the way. We in a culture that often says, your back's going to give out, or you won't be able to hear, or whatever. Try it and see, because age is so seldom the actual, there is, oh, I'm so sorry. There is no such thing as age appropriate, except for children. It just doesn't exist. It's a bullshit way to divide us and make us self-conscious and isolate us and segregate us.
And I have to admit, the idea of having intergenerational friends is quite alien to me. I find myself becoming quite formal in front of people that I perceive to be older, etc. So how do
you are British.
Break down? Indeed, it's my years of conditioning. So how do you break down, you know, all of that conditioning?
You just chip away at it bit by bit. I mean, if you know, it always seems easy, hard, you know, hard until you do it. But honestly, age tells you almost nothing about a person. If I could put one fact in every head in the world, it would be that the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. The way scientists put it is heterogeneity is the defining trait of aging, right? See, I make that slip too. So the older the person, we age at different rates, physically, cognitively, and socially. The older the person, the less their age tells you about them. So I think we all do have this idea, like, I won't have anything in common with that young person or with that older person. But you know, you're at an event, you must know the music playing or the person who hosted the event, or you must think that, you know, hors d'oeuvre tasted disgusting or tasted delicious. There's always somewhere to begin. You may or may not like that person. You may or may not end up having anything in common with them, but it won't be because of how old they are. And of course, it's like anything else. Once you start, you're like, oh, that was fun. And you might even, you know, think especially, I have to say, as a feminist, I feel it's especially important for we women to come together at all ages and support each other, because it's easy to forget how hard it is being young, right? And it's easy for if more younger women were friends with the dozens of really powerful women I know who are deeply content with being older, no one wants to be any younger, right? Then they would be less afraid of getting older, and we would start to have genuine conversations, not about aging, but about, you know, gardening or protesting or whatever the hell you actually want to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really liked the notion in your book of moving from kind of pity to justice for older people, and
younger people and younger people
of all ages. And you also you dedicated a whole chapter to misconceptions about Alzheimer's, showing that while most people experience minor cognitive declines, the majority of people still have their marbles. So why do you think we have this anxiety over losing our memory?
Because it's terrifying. Because it's an utterly understandable human fear. And because the Alzheimer's Foundation needs to raise a shit ton of money every year. And when people are afraid, they, you know, fear divides us, and fear is profitable. The really progressive people in sort of the dementia corner of old land, as I sometimes refer to it, are, you know, they see brain health as a continuum, which of course it is. Just like, you know, you don't fall off a cliff and wake up old one day. You don't wake up unable to remember, you know, your name and who the person lying next to you in bed with. We all, I mean, about 20% of the population escapes cognitive decline entirely. And think about it. You all know some of those really sharp 80 and 90-year-olds, like my dear friend Susie Griggs, who was on this phone call, and who is a Londoner. And most of us will lose some processing speed, in particular, you know, the ability to recall the name of the movie you saw with what's her name. But and it's annoying. And I wish it didn't happen. But when we think, oh crap, I think that's the first sign of Alzheimer's, then we prime the fear itself is bad for us, the stress, right? And then we set ourselves up for that expectation. Just like if your knee twinges, you know, you think, oh crap, there goes my cartilage. Well, it might be, but might be the only time it twinges. Odds are it's some cartilage, but you're going to hobble along just fine to the end, right? Another thing nobody knows is that Alzheimer's rates are declining fast. Yes. You know, and that's from the New York Times. It's a terrible disease. It would be fantastic to cure it, but our fears, again, are way out of proportion to the reality. And there's a theory that came out of computation science that the reason it takes older people longer to remember things is because we're processing more data. There's just more stuff to go through. And in theory, then we come up with more, you know, wise or recent answers. I don't think older people are wiser than young people necessarily, but I think older people are valuable. And I think that kind of experience, especially in the workforce, has value for all sorts of intuitively obvious reasons, just as it's great to have younger people who might come up with more ideas faster, but some of which the older people on the team will go, well, here, here's why that might not work, but I wouldn't have thought of that one. Let's build on that one together. Age diverse, just like ethnic diversity, just like gender and sexual orientation diversity. It's good for us.
Mm-hmm. And I found some of the effects on health you described in your book quite sad, so that doctors often chalk genuine medical symptoms experienced by older people down as old age. And I wondered if you thought there was anything we could do about that. Could people kind of advocate for themselves and demand treatment?
Hell yes. Although it's difficult, you need to be assertive. You need to have confidence, and women tend to have less, and women of color have less, and then queer women have, the more marginalized you are, the harder it is, the less likely you are to have the resources to, whether it's time or money, to go find a better doctor. I mean, if your doctor ever says at your age, what do you expect? Find another doctor. It's like the old gag, which was not mine in the TED Talk, but I stopped blaming my sore knee on I'm now 68 because my other knee doesn't hurt and it's just as old. Right? That's a classic, and it's a classic example of blaming something physical on age when age is in fact not the case. We have a deeply ageist and sexist and racist medical establishment. So, educate yourself and bring an advocate, and do not settle for age being used as the reason, or why, if you have my physical therapist, because my body's, it's my bones that are giving out. And she had a woman patient of hers who's in her mid 80s who had a shoulder replacement. She's doing great. Psychotherapy, there's this notion that you can't, teach an old dog new tricks. Well, you may not be able to teach an old dog new tricks, but you couldn't teach that dog tricks when it was young either, right? That stubbornness or narrow-mindedness is not something we acquire with age. I think my theory about why that's such a pervasive stereotype is that often as you get older, you have less energy. You might have less, you can't jump up and run out the door the way you used to. And so you rely more on routine and on conserving energy and perhaps resources if you're living on a fixed budget. But it doesn't mean that you're stuck in your ways or wouldn't love to run out the door and do something wild and crazy, right? Talk to the person. It's the same rule as, breaching any other boundary. Talk to the person and listen to them with an open mind.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us a bit about the World Health Organization's goal to increase health span rather than lifespan?
Yeah, the World Health Organization is doing fantastic work. One of the things they are doing is launching later this year a global anti-ageism campaign, because they have all the data that I already referred to about the effect of attitudes towards aging. And they figured this was the most effective way to improve global health, right? It's not the World Old People Organization, is to educate people about age and aging. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's amazing. And there was another chapter, perhaps my favorite chapter in the book, dedicated to dismantling the ew factor around older people having sex. And one of your suggestions is that dating sites should remove age, take it out of the algorithm so that people are matched on their preferences rather than age. Is that something that you are seriously recommending?
I would like age not to appear on line one. It's, and I would like your photograph to look like you actually look like, because let's face it, that matters. Although OkCupid, the dating site here, did a famous experiment a while ago, but they took all pictures off for a day or 6 hours or something. And it turned out that people who met during that period formed more, I don't know if they, all jumped into bed and lived happily ever after, but they formed more lasting and more satisfying relationships, even if it was just chatting with someone who turned out to be interesting, than when people could instantly judge by the image, which of course is not all that surprising. How old are you can be the second question, but unless you are actually want to make babies, because really that's the only, and how much sex is for making babies, let's face it. There is no other reason why the age of the woman in particular, but both partners, should be all that salient. People want to know, of course you want to know. I'm not saying it should be hidden. I will make the same argument about newspaper stories. We used to put race in newspaper stories and we don't do it anymore. I'd like it to be out of there unless it's an obituary or a story about a prodigy, because we all want to know how old that person is, but the habit of wanting to know, which is really hard to break. You know, someone tells me they're dating someone new, my first thought is, how old are they? But pigeonholing people by that, you know, and again, we all need to pigeonhole. It's handy. We can't evaluate every single person on every single trajectory on first acquaintance, but it does allow us to fall back on our deeply ageist assumptions, which we all have, about what that number says they're capable of or interesting in, and we need to break that habit.
Yeah, I really liked the way in your book you described how it was a lazy signifier, and so actually relying on it, you know, might lead us to a completely wrong conclusion about somebody.
Or just not to, you know, not to find out more, I think more to close the door before we even, you know, sort of glimpsed in and see what's there.
And why do you think society would be richer if people had, if people kind of opened their dating pool to a wider range of ages?
For the same reason society would be richer if we all had, you know, new friends with all kinds of sexual orientations and all kinds of cultural backgrounds, who spoke all kinds of language. You know, life is richer. It's like a meal. There's a brilliantly original analogy, but you know, if there's more flavors, you know, you challenge yourself, and it enriches your life, and we come up with more interesting and equitable looks at the world and at each other.
Wow, I hope everyone in the audience, you know, kind of breaks away from their partner and looks.
Go talk to an old person.
Yeah.
But and also and for olders to reach out to youngers too. You know, it's very easy to you know, to get stuck, and it's, you know, most people are, at least, you know, they're not hostile to the idea. And the minute it's like anything else, the minute you break, and I'm very shy. I hate cocktail parties, or I generally follow my partner around and wait till, you know, he's talked to someone interesting, and then I sneak over. But you know, the minute you do it, you find you don't necessarily like the person, but age is such a minor attribute, actually.
Yeah, it's really good to realize
whether you like each other, whether you have something in common.
Yeah, for sure, to encourage us to kind of think about the person rather than just their age. And what about the representation of older people in books, films, TVs, etc.? Lots of the Groucho members work in the media. How do you think they could help foster more accurate and more diverse representations of older people?
You know, simply include them. I imagine I mean, I'm thinking of all the millions of wonderful British novels I've read with fabulous older characters. Yeah, I think advertising is the biggest problem here. It is a deeply ageist industry. The average age, it's almost as bad as tech, which I think is the worst. It certainly is the worst here, and Hollywood too. You know, if we don't see pictures of older people, just as if we don't see pictures of people of color, you know, or whatever, or people with disabilities, right? Representations of older people need to have people using walkers and people in wheelchairs, because their lives are every bit as rich and meaningful. And if they're not there, it's not only sort of consigned to that monster under the bed zone of our darkest fears, where if you actually go and talk to someone, you know, in a wheelchair, you'll learn a lot more about what it's like to be a wheelchair user. It's really important to represent age in all its diversity. In fashion is interesting because, you know, if you're a model and you're over, 18, you're over the hill, and then you're sort of invisible for 80 years. And then there is this fetishization of very old, very chic women, which I think is quite interesting. But frankly, we also need more of us who are in the sort of middle, not stick thin, not hyper fashionable middle, especially women. I mean, we know in movies that men, that older women are almost entirely missing, that when they are given, did you know there's the fabulous, what's her name? The rule, if the feminist rule, she's a graphic novelist, I can't remember her name, that if it gets a prize if two women in a movie have a conversation about something besides the leading man. I propose the Applewhite Test, which is if two older people get together and talk about something besides falling apart, right? So, just the fact that they're old doesn't mean the only thing they have to talk about is how ancient they are and how much it sucks, right? It's a piece of life. It's important to acknowledge age and not pretend, not wish it away, but show diversity. Show us in all our. And there's no group more diverse than older people. Everyone's aging. Half of us aren't young anymore. It's a big pool to choose from.
Yeah, for sure. It was interesting. After I read your book, I started noticing that all the depictions of older people in the media, either they had clearly a much younger person with kind of dyed white hair. So, older people as very content painters or as kind of kindly old.
Placid.
Yeah. And I wondered where the kind of screeching grandmothers or the, people who cheat.
Anger, very not sanctioned for women, especially old women. The harshest misogyny is reserved for older women. They're really, from witches onward, older women, because I think of I didn't make this up, but the power of older women, the power of women, period, and the power of older women. We really do come into our own, and that is threatening to patriarchy. So very harsh measures used to keep us in our place. But we can come together and do something about that.
And one of my main fears, as is expressed by the people that you interviewed in the book, is being alone and being lonely when I'm old. And you chalked that down to the American notion that success is connected to independence and that most people want to be self-sufficient, so they're almost scared of asking for help. And I think that applies to British culture a lot as well. I was really struck when I lived in India for 6 months, and there were lots of intergenerational families. So the grandparents nearly always lived in a house with newlyweds and grandchildren. And when I came back, I felt very sad about, my own grandmother living alone. So how do you think we can better foster a culture where older people feel that they can rely on others and that they're not possibly perceive themselves as a burden?
Well, one of my favorite quotes that's in the book is by a Dutch gerontologist, that autonomy requires collaborators, right? I would like to take the whole word independent or independence out of the whole discourse. No one is independent ever. And it sets up this false binary, like old, young, like mobile, immobile, like healthy and sick. As we get older, we acquire chronic conditions. And you don't, but we live well, not by avoiding them or pretending they don't exist, by adapting to them. I think that my spoiled baby boom generation is going to refuse to go into nasty nursing homes. And we are developing more intergenerational housing, more communal housing, and developing, I hope, models that will be affordable. It links to what I was saying earlier. If we have friends of all ages, it is easier. We have no one, we need more help with things as we get older, and some of those changes are not welcome. It is the loss of physical function is really unpleasant and unwelcome. I don't want to beat the bush around that, but asking for help should not be shameful. When I don't know if you have children, but when I had 2 little kids and was wrangling a stroller and hadn't gotten any sleep and whatever, I needed a ton of help. You need a ton of help if you break your foot and you're trying to bring in the groceries. We all need help lifelong. So to consciously practice asking for help. I used to, hoist my suitcase down the stairs into the subway back when there was a subway I could get on. And I just thought, what the hell am I waiting for? Ask someone to help me. What do I need to wait till I really literally can't lift it? And these are hard habits to break, but people love helping, and we have a lot to learn from people in the disability justice movement, many of whom have, they use the word interdependence. They have mutual aid societies. They celebrate their, these very powerful, fierce communities that they have made because the outside world has so disregarded and left them out. Why don't they have, disabled people consulted on disability products, for example? Why don't they have older people involved in design products for tech devices? Because something that works well for someone with a disability. And really, when we talk about older people in that context, we are talking about people whose eyes and ears don't work as well. God damn it. You know, those things work better for everybody. It's not zero sum, it's the opposite.
And I was really surprised, given our capitalist world, that there's this huge market of older people that presumably use products, and yet, you know, they're not designed for them. Why do you think that is? It seems baffling to me.
Because they don't invite old people to help design them, and because the people designing the products have not addressed their own internalized ageism. I mean, it cracks me up how many people, even when I'm doing a panel of, you know, aging services people and everyone is a million years old, they are still talking about older people as them rather than us, right? And as long as you, and it was one of the many things I was staggered to learn early on. I thought, well, you know, wow, I figured out ageism is this giant problem, and it's why older people don't get, you know, don't get respected, get laid off from work, et cetera, et cetera. The people in Old Land are going to be so happy to hear this. They are often the most ageist of all, because they often do the really important work of dealing with people at the most vulnerable end of the spectrum, and reconciling that view of old age, which is real, with what we hope lies ahead for ourselves is a really hard task. But if you're not even going to go there, or you're going to think, oh, I'm just going to get this nifty robot and it's going to let me know how mom is, that's a much easier way to deal with this terrifying possibility that mom may not be okay someday, than actually hanging out with mom. I don't mean to oversimplify it, and think about her life in all its complexity, and how you could form a more organic, sustainable, affordable, blah, 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 solution for her, which will be different than for her next door neighbor.
Mm-hmm. And I think we've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll just open up questions to the audience now. So we've had one question already. Can we change language that belittles older folk? For example, a weak man being like an old woman. If anyone else has a question, we'll unmute you now. So after Ashton answers that one, anyone will be free to ask.
I mean, talk about misogyny. Why is being called an old woman an insult, right? And why is labeling a man that? I mean, we know the answer, but we can do that by, of course, watching our own language, which can start with just the simple trick of thinking about how you use the words old and young. You know, we use young to mean insert good thing, vigorous, attractive, with it. And when people say, I feel old, what they really mean is, I'm in pain, or I feel invisible, I feel incompetent. We can feel, I felt more of those things when I was 13 than I have ever since. So that's an example of how you can often take age out of it. So try and break the habit and call out ageist stuff. I started the Yo Is This Ageist blog, imitating the fabulous Yo Is This Racist blog, with permission, where people can send in examples of something they have seen or heard or said or experienced, and to ask, is it ageist? By and large, if the same comment or behavior or whatever made on the basis of race or sex wouldn't get a green light, it's not okay either. Those disgusting birthday cards. I remember I was in London when I bought a card that said, like all women my age, I am 29 years old. Why just put the question out there? Why should waking up a day older be something to be ashamed of? It's embarrassing to be called out as older until we quit being embarrassed about it. But we need to engage in that with others. So, don't call people something you wouldn't want to be called yourself. That's a good rule of thumb in our, politically correct minefield. Ask someone what they want to be called. And if it seems like it's denigrating, think about why it should be. Why should being called an old woman be an insult? And why do we put up with it?
And are there any questions from the audience? If not, I've definitely got a few more.
I wondered if I could ask a question, actually, Ashton. Hello.
Hi.
I wanted to know, what tip or piece of information about aging would you have wanted to know in your teens or early 20s?
Oh my gosh, be less afraid. I mean, when I was in my teens or 20s, I didn't even think about getting older, truthfully. And I don't think that's ageist. I think it's just human. You know, when you're a kid, you run everywhere. You can't, why on earth are all the grownups, you know, sitting there just talking? How boring could it be? You don't think about what it's going to be like, you know, to be now, of course, I'm the slug who never wants to stand up. But certainly, I mean, there's a thing in my book where I appropriate a phrase by a geriatrician who calls herself an old person in training. And I realized early on, I was like, I don't know what that means, but I think it's what I have become, to look at the older people around us. And, you know, when you are young, ideally, and look at the behaviors they do that you like, and also the ones that you don't like. What are the ones you want to be around? What are some things about the way they are in the world? Simply looking at them instead of past them, which we tend to do in our age segregated world. And the earlier in life we start that, the less likely we are to get on this expensive, demoralizing, futile hamster wheel of denial. That is where ageism sinks its fangs into us, right? It's never going to happen to me. And honestly, when you're 22, you just don't think it is ever going to happen to you. And you know, and part of that is because of ageism, but also you're too busy being 22. But sooner or later, you know, some of these things, not all of them, happen to you. And if you have not set yourself up to think, oh, somehow if I eat enough, you know, kale, or do enough sit-ups, or meditate enough, or you know, all these privileged examples or whatever, it won't happen to me, and think more realistically about it, you're just in much better shape.
I think it also depends on how many people of different ages you have around you.
Yeah.
In terms of whether that's family or social, or do you talk to your neighbors? You know, who do you know of different ages, just generally?
I mean, and I would urge you to reach beyond family. I mean, the only time, I'm sure that's an exaggeration, but sporting events and family gatherings, weddings and stuff are of course mixed age, but they are unusual. So, you know, think of something you like to do and find a mixed age group to do it with. And, you know, read the damn book, and you know, have a reading group. I mean, I guarantee you, I will see if Madeline agrees, but you will smack your head on every other page going, geez, why didn't I think about that? You know, it's not that I'm a genius, it's that these ideas are still so unexamined in the culture. I mean, I ask people all the time, you know, I say, what do you think of as criteria for diversity? And people say, of course, race and sexual orientation, gender, blah, blah. So, and if they don't say age, and they usually don't, and I say, what about age? No one says that's a dumb idea. No one says, let me get back to you. They say, why didn't I think of that? And it's very liberating.
And Ashton, how do you recommend people sit with themselves and examine their ageist assumptions? What recommendations?
Kindly, be nice to yourself. You know, it's hard. Unlearning is really hard. And the first most important step is to look at your own bias, because we can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it. And when it comes to age, it's a new idea to most of us. So, you know, be kind, but to yourself and to others. You know, when someone says something ageist, it's really tempting to snap at them, as you might imagine, even having only known me for 45 minutes. That's that's what I really want to do. But instead of saying, you know, don't say that, you know, what do you mean by that? Is a very good all-purpose response to an ageist comment, because it makes the person reflect on what they do. Why did they assume I was retired? You know, why did they? You know, I've only come up with one good snappy answer to you look great for your age, is to say you look great for your age too. And let that uncomfortable, you know, thing sit there for a minute, and they have to think about, why did something they intended as a compliment not feel like a compliment? And that's, in little ways like that, we change the culture. But the first step is to look at your own prejudice. And we're all biased. We're all biased all the time.
In relation to that, do you have a different strategy for tackling structural ageism from individual ageism? Or do you think it's all on a continuum? Many individuals will make up a structure.
I would say if I had to choose, it's a continuum. I think we're learning so much, so many white people in America, at least, about learning about and addressing their own internalized racism, and then hopefully taking that out in the world, because I think Black Lives Matter has made it clear that the issue is systemic racism rooted in 400 years of racist behavior in institutions in the US. Someone cracked on Twitter, I remember, that a zillion white Americans reading books and reading groups about racism is no more comfort than if they were reading books about flood control would be to people displaced by Hurricane Katrina, right? You need, but I do think even if you just change your own thinking a little bit, karmically, you take a different energy. Even if you're in line at the supermarket and you engage differently with someone who is different in age from you next to the frozen peas, that is changing the culture. And then you take it on out as far as you can. I mean, I will give a brief plug for a website called Old School, oldschool.info. It's a clearinghouse of free, vetted anti-ageism resources, from videos to books to talks to workshops. If you feel like, and we have a whole campaign section which shows that a movement is underway. Tremendous interest in the UK. There's Bristol and Leeds, Leicester, I think, are doing anti-ageism campaigns. And so there are lots of examples out there for ways to get involved if you want to. If all you want to do is nothing, but I don't think you'd be on this call, no judgment. This stuff is hard. But it's really rewarding. Hi.
Can I ask something? Thank you so much for this talk, and also the book is incredible, and I was absolutely slapping myself in the head on each one. I'm perplexed, thinking how this has trailed the other, because I've absolutely digested all the kind of negative. And do you have a theory, or is it just the economic ones that you've mentioned, why this has trailed every other kind of ism?
I think it is partly that longer lives are a pretty recent phenomenon.
Hey guys, I'm going to just do the fish. I'm ready.
Someone's eating fish. Mute yourself, please. Oma, thank you. I think it's, if we look at human evolution, these longer lives are in the blink of an eye. I mean, the average American lifespan in 1900 was 49 for a man. Now it's 79. That's slightly deceptive because the biggest driver of population aging is fertility rates. Many more people survive to adulthood, but we still have gained an average of 10 healthy years. And, really in 2 generations, which is amazing. And this stuff is new. It's not all ageism, right? It's that that rituals and institutions have yet to evolve. But in a cutthroat, hyper-capitalist society, that it's the other, we're not a very family-friendly society either, at least not in the US. If you don't make money and you don't, contribute, kids don't vote, it is very easy. We're back to, a society being judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members. But I think that there is interest now because there are so many people in my age, in our 60s, 50s, 70s that are realized, like, this is happening. I am still full of beans. I don't want to be dismissed. And I'm also optimistic about the movement against ageism hugely, in the sense that because there is more awareness, as you say, of racism and of sexism, that and the understanding of intersectionality and the way these prejudices interact and reinforce each other, that to hitch age to that sled, if you will, is a much smaller ask than it was to say in the 70s, women should get paid the same as men and, run companies. So I think that we are starting from a much more exciting place, and it's underway.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who came. Thank you, Ashton. This has been so inspiring, and it's really inspired me to examine my own ageism and to stop using ageist language and to really think about the support available for older people. And I definitely think I'll have more productive conversations with my own grandmother as a
They
result.
don't have to be productive. They can be about the fish, really. Low bar, low bar.
So yeah, we'll be back on November the 18th for next month's club. So if you will keep an eye out on the Groucho newsletters, we'll be announcing the author very shortly. And have a great rest of the evening, everyone. Thank you again, Ashton. Would you just like to tell everyone where they can buy your book just before everyone leaves?
I'll just tell you my website, which is thischairrocks.com, and I'm at thischairrocks on Twitter and Instagram, and it's really easy to find me or my book. Also, I'm the only Ashton Applewhite in the world, even if Shireen did contact the wrong Ashton, okay? Sorry to out you.
I know, I'm still outraged about that, Ashton, but she was delighted to know that she wasn't alone.
Well, I'll work on it. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Madeline.